Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to the first ever edition of NBO Lit Fest, which is presented by Book Bank. My name is Angela Washuka, and I am a founder at Book Bank Trust. And this festival is anchored in Nairobi's public libraries, and is also a celebration of the Macmillan Memorial Library's 90th anniversary. If you're new to the work that we are doing at Book Bank to transform public libraries, please visit bookbank.org to explore our grand vision for public libraries. Thank you for joining us. And for now, some house rules. Please keep your mics muted for the duration of the event. And this is also a live event, and we'll feature a Q&A session at the end of the discussion. So please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And this session is also streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. So if you're streaming online, Karibu Sana, tweet us your questions, and our hashtag across all social media platforms is NBO LitFest. We'd also love your feedback. So polls will pop up on your screen during the conversation. There's likely one on your screen now asking you how you got here. So we appreciate your feedback. So do please share that with us. Before I hand over to Ellah Wakatama, who will introduce this session, as well as Namina Forna, I'd like to thank the people that have made this event possible. Our funders, Sharjah World Book Capital, Sigrid Rousing Trust in London, the Embassy of the Netherlands in Nairobi. We also have programming partners, the British Council, the Glasgow Women's Library, Sahifa Jano, and Baraza Media Lab. And to all my wonderful colleagues at Book Bank who've worked for months to deliver this festival, asanteni sana, and enjoy the conversation. Namina Forna will be in conversation with Ellah Wakatama, who is the editor-at-large at Canongate Books Limited. She's a senior research fellow at Manchester University's Centre for New Writing, and also chair of the Caine Prize for African Writing. She's a trustee of the Royal Literary Fund and the Caine Prize for African Writing, and sits on the advisory board for Art for Amnesty and the editorial advisory panel of the Johannesburg Review of Books. She's the editor of Africa 39, an anthology that was published by Bloomsbury in 2014, and the anthology Safe House, Explorations in Creative Nonfiction, published by Dandam and Cassava Republic. She's also a contributor to New Daughters of Africa, which was published in 2019. Her introduction to Woman of the Aeroplanes by Kojo Lane was published by Pearson in 2012. In 2011, she was awarded an OBE for services to the publishing industry, and in 2016 was named one of New African Magazine's 100 most influential Africans. Welcome to the session, Ellah, and over to you.
I think you're on mute.
I'm trying to obey the tech instructions and took it one step too far. Forgive me. I was saying, Titambire, thank you very much, and welcome, Karibu, to everybody. I'm so happy to be here. And before I start, I do want to encourage everyone in the audience to log into the BookBuck website. I'm one of Ashuka's biggest fans, and the work that she and her wonderful colleagues are doing to reinvigorate libraries is hugely important. So it's a great honor to be part of the festival today. And it's even bigger honor and just a humongous joy for me to be in conversation with Namina Forna, who I have to say is the writer I've been pressing upon everyone I meet since I read her wonderful book, The Gilded Ones. Namina is published in the UK, but I was born in the US by Random House. Born in Sierra Leone, she has lived in the US since the age of 9, but continues to spend time in Sierra Leone. She's a screenwriter living in Los Angeles. The Gilded Ones is a New York Times bestseller. It's best described, I guess, as epic fantasy, although I think maybe it might need its own category. I look forward to discussing that. And it's the story of one young woman's fight for her right and the rights of others like her to exist in a society built on secrets and lies. It's a bold book that has got the most glorious imagining and world building, both in terms of time and place. And it's chillingly believable. Namina, welcome. It's so wonderful to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. It's like I brought it up this morning because I'm like, yes, let's do this.
Well, because of the time difference, yes, it's the crack of dawn for you. I want to start off thinking about what Washuka said in the introduction about libraries. I'm really interested in to hear people's experiences of early reading. And because this session we're going to focus very much on your journey and the details of writing the book, I thought that we could maybe start off before we have the conversation and you do your reading and we ask the audience some questions. Let's start with your origin story. Every superhero needs an origin story. And I guess I want to start with yours. And if you could focus a little bit on how you became a reader and what the place of books was in your very, very early young life, so we can learn a little bit about what it is that drives you.
So I grew up in Sierra Leone, which is right on the west coast of Africa. When I was growing up, my father was a massive reader. In fact, like one sort of floor of our house was just basically entire books. It was wall to wall to wall of books. And when I was growing up, it was at the start of the Sierra Leonean Civil War. So even before the war hit Sierra Leone, there was always like this sort of underlying feeling of tension and just, you know, like as a kid, you feel it. And for me, how I coped, especially because during this time, like a lot of people that I grew up with just sort of started disappearing and nobody would tell me where they went or what happened. But I knew something was wrong. So how I coped, because I knew there were things I wasn't supposed to see and I knew it wasn't safe, I just read. I would read like my father was the one who taught me how to read. By age 4, he like handed me, because we were just a reading family. And by age 4, he handed me a dictionary. He's like, you're good to go. If you don't understand any concepts or anything, come back and ask me. But before you do that, look at the dictionary. So like,
were you big enough to carry a dictionary? I'm just imagining this tiny little girl.
You should have seen me walking up the street with my little dictionary, like showing, like, because like I knew everybody, you know how you know everybody in your neighborhood. So I'm like showing like our neighborhood bread maker, look, so I found this word and this word and this word. And look, and they'd be like, oh, that's so sweet. Because they're like, look at this child. She always has, like, I was the kid who I carried books like just in case, like when I went places, just in case of anything, I had a book. So like I was very easily occupied. Like I read to the point where my eyes just got nearsighted. It was really bad. But anyway, so growing up in Sierra Leone, like, on one hand, you know, Sierra Leone is a magical place. Like we grew up next to a marsh that like looked out on the oceans and like you could see whales in the distance and all these things. It was really beautiful. But on the other hand, there were always things that, like, aside from the war, that I always had questions about. And one of the things that I had questions about was FGM, female genital mutilation. Because in Sierra Leone, you know, like about 90% of women are circumcised. And in fact, my grandmother wanted me to be circumcised, which became a whole issue where it's like I couldn't go to her house because she was always sort of scheming about it. And it wasn't like it was for her a bad thing. It was just in her mind, she, I think I'm getting feedback from someone. Could we mute? Where am I? But I think in her mind that she thought that this was what would make me, like, you know, a good woman, a good wife, like all these things. So it wasn't something that she was doing. I think Book Bonk, could we mute? So it wasn't something that she was doing because like she wanted to be evil or anything like this. It was basically just because in her mind, this was what you needed in order to become a woman. And I always sort of thought about that. I was like, why is it that this thing that hurts so many people, that kills so many people, is thought of as good. And not only that, people pitch it to you in a way where it's like, oh, it's for your purity and it's for your this and it's for your that. And I not only had questions about that, but also like about like why there was this automatic assumption that because you're a woman, or rather because you are femme presenting, you automatically must cook, clean, serve. Because like when you're talking to a Sierra Leone like guy, like it isn't out of the thing for somebody to be like, but do you cook? Do you whatever? You know? And I always thought like, why are things this way? This just does not seem right and it doesn't seem fair. So then I moved to America at age 9 because, you know, basically the war. And I thought it was going to be a better place, like in terms of gender dynamics, because even at age 9, I was like, oh, what's happening in Sierra Leone with like women is sort of like BS. But then I came to America and I realized, oh, y'all are just like more polite about your sexism. And that was what I found fascinating, is that misogyny often takes on this sort of benevolent bent where it's like people will say things, but they'll be like, oh, it's for your own good, you know, pat, pat, pat on your head. You don't know any better, you know, and it was just like all the slut shaming and the harassment and all these things. And every time I ask questions, people will be like, oh, you know, what's wrong with you? Like, you're the one always asking questions and spoiling things. And it was only when I went to Spelman College, undergrad, and it's like Spelman is all Black and all female. And I took women's studies courses that I finally realized, oh my God, this is a system. This is something that was created. And that was like sort of the reason why I came up with the Gilded Ones, because I'd had so many questions and been shut down so many times. And I wanted to make it easier for the next person, girl, boy, gender binary, trans, like whomever. Like I wanted to make it easier for people to see that, oh, the system of this binary, it is a system. And it's a system that we are even now sort of upholding.
Namina, I can't think of a better education for a superhero than Spelman with women's studies as your major. I can just think of all of the sort of the intellectual power behind that. It's interesting to me to sort of, you've already taken us on this wonderful journey in your origin story, I guess. And you talk a little bit about stories as escape, but stories are also in your telling about a way to understand the world, a way to make sense of the world. And it seems to me that from a very young age, you were using them as a reader, as a way to do both of those things. And it's really fascinating for me to be able to make these links between what you're seeing in your country of birth, what you're seeing in your adopted country, and your sense of self as a person, and how you want to change things. Let's just talk a little bit more about sort of your family and storytelling. One of the things that I love about the Gilded Ones is that from the very beginning, one is immersed in Otera. You're immersed in this place that you've created. So, for example, I never found myself trying to guess, oh, I wonder where she got this from, I wonder where she got this from, because it was so completely imagined as a world. How long had you lived in Otera or known of it before you actually put it down on paper?
So that's like a little bit of a complicated question, in that the book that I wrote in 2018 is a form of a book that I wrote in 2012. Okay. So I'd been in Otera for a long time, but by the time I got to the draft that actually got published, basically, so when I was at Spelman, I started having these dreams of a girl wearing golden armor and she's walking slow motion on a battlefield. I didn't know who this girl was. And I never knew where the dream went, because like she'd walk slow motion and then she'd jump up in the air, sword in each hand, and then the dream would cut out. So I never knew where it went, but I knew that this girl was important. And I knew that she was connected to my desire to write this book that explains what it looks like when you like, I would like, I hesitate to say that this is an extreme version of what it looks like when you live in a supremely patriarchal world, because I honestly do think because the girls in my book, they bleed gold and therefore are thought of as monsters. And the idea is you see a monster and you kill it on sight, but then actual monsters come into this world. And these girls who bleed gold are faster and stronger than regular people. And so the humans are like, let's pit them against each other and hopefully they'll, sort themselves out. So like, that's the story. And the things that happen to these girls because they bleed gold, I actually don't think is too outrageous, because the reason why I made these girls bleed gold was because this book talks about the commodification of women, meaning that women are often seen as objects and are often reduced to a monetary value. And I was like, this is the most extreme, this is the easiest way that I can show that. And sadly, what happens to a lot of the girls in the book, I don't actually think is, if like there were girls who bled gold right now in this world, I think what happened to them in the book would be what happens to them in real life, because that's sadly like what happens with a lot of women. But like, to circle back, once I had this idea, I was like, okay, I want to set it in an African world. And I didn't know what the story was until like 2012. I'm like sitting in class in film school, because I went to USC film school. I did my master's in film production, and I'm sitting in class bored out of my mind, and like the words drop into my head. And from there, I'm like so excited. I tell everybody about it, and then I take a step.
Namina? What were the words that dropped into your head?
So this is the thing, like again, the version from 2012 is different from 2018, because in the 2012 version, she starts off like being young. And so the words are, I was 9 years old when first I learned I could not die. And that was the first iteration of the Gilded Ones. And so I wrote that book, and I did my research, and I wrote that book in 2012. And so I had the world then. But like, of course, when I tried to send it out, it didn't really get anywhere. So by 2018, when it was time, that's why I could write it so fast. Cause like, I think it was like late 2017, I'm basically writing clickbait, like you'll never guess what happened, or you'll never get what's Beyonce did today. And I hated that job so much. Oh my God. Like, I suck at office jobs, y'all, just so you know. I suck at office. Like, you should never have me in, because I'm an extreme introvert. Like, people talking, passing by, all these things. Like, it was really stressful and I hated it. So when I saw, like, part of my job was to see what was trending, and I saw the promos for Black Panther coming and like the reception that it was getting. And I was like, oh, it's time for the Gilded Ones. It's finally time. So I tell my agent about it. And I'm like, I have this book. It requires a page one rewrite, meaning I'm tossing away what I had. And she's like, oh, go ahead. I write that book in a month and a half. And the reason I was able to write it so fast was because I already had the world. And to an extent, I already had the story, although I aggressively sort of changed the story. But yeah, so that's how
I love that you're telling us this. Oh my God, you can see I'm getting completely overexcited. I want to go back in a little bit for us to talk about the world building. But one of my questions to you was actually going to be about timing. And you've answered that beautifully. So you knew 6 years before what you wanted to do. The ancestors had spoken to you. You had worked on your craft. You had the story, and it was written down. But it was watching to see when things would turn. Because for me, I'm a lot older than you are, and remember being in my 20s as a science fiction geek who wanted to read people like me and not finding anything. I found Octavia Butler, I found Samuel Delaney, and then I thought, okay, what's next? And it was really difficult. And at this moment in time, one can pick your book, one can pick several other books that are written by Africans in this speculative space. Did you have a sense, let's talk back in 2012, that it was just a matter of time, or were you just being hopeful and just believing?
So, all right. I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a polite way.
You don't need to actually be polite. I think
Oh,
we all know what we're
all right,
dealing
so
with.
I'm be real. Like, so
Yeah.
I always knew that I had the stories and that I had the worlds. But the sad thing is, in 2012, and even now, publishing was hella racist. That is the reality. It did not matter how good a writer I was. Like, it didn't matter the stories that I
Okay.
in 2012 was that I had Black skin, and in publishing at that time, basically what people would tell you is that Black books don't sell. And particular, like, you can, like, as an African, I could have written a book and probably to huge acclaim when I was younger, but it would have to be that, you know, the African narrative of it's a war, like fanciful language and all these things. But I always wanted to be a young adult novelist, because I think, and a children's novelist in particular, because for me, I love speaking to people whose minds are developing and whose minds are open. And I also wanted to create safe spaces for people, younger people particularly, because that's what the authors when I was young did for me. So that's what I wanted to do. But the reality was, especially in young adult and in children's literature, as a Black person, there just simply was no avenue. And like literally, when I wrote The Gilded Ones in 2012, it was a good book in 2012, and it should have been published around that time. The reason why I changed it so aggressively in 2018 was because I had to do so many things to sort of remove parts of myself and parts, because like, remember in 2012, you couldn't talk feminism, you couldn't talk Black issues, you couldn't talk any of this stuff. So I had to remove, basically extract all of those things, which was why I was like, I need to completely rewrite it in 2018, because now is the time where I can go as hard as I could, and like the message would be received. But the message, I feel, should have been able to be received in 2012, except racism. And that's the reality.
Coming, you know, as a publisher who was working at that time and feeling that frustration, I think that you have no need to be polite, because you're correct. What I want to ask you, and I'm sorry, I think all the questions will be difficult because I think about you and your book a lot. So I've got lots of difficult questions.
I'm here, we're friends having a conversation.
So do you think that because you grew up the child of African parents, having spent your childhood in a country where you're not a minority, where that's not your identity, and then going to an, you know, historically